So today I would like to talk about the genesis of the preaching orders during the 13th century, and so namely, obviously, the order of the preacher friars and the order of the friars minor, um, um, being, a very important topic relatively to the history of Western Christendom, and a process that really changed the face of Europe from that time on. Um, Starting from the order of the preachers, we obviously remember Dominic of Calarwega. Um, so he came from this bishopric of Osma in Castilla. So he was Spanish, and he was a canon who collaborated with the Bishop of Toulouse in southern France, in a very peculiar context that was the emergence, or the spread at least, of the Cathar threat, obviously in Catholic perspective. And what does Dominic do? He basically specialized himself and his I don't know how to call them, comrades. sounds weird, but as a matter of fact it is, because they were meant to fight in a way against heresy. And in fact, they specialized themselves in the anti-heretical preaching. Mm. So it was quite important because it did not just operate as these friars wandering around, but the Dominicans were meant to act within a bishopric, to check whether these areas, these groups of which comprehended obviously the clergy and the obviously the Christian fellows. I mean the faithfuls to Catholicism, and therefore to strengthen the Catholic orthodoxy where this was seen as lacking. And it would be interesting to concentrate on really how much the Cathars were really a heretical movement, how much of this character of theirs actually came from sort of extremization of the judgment of the Roman Church, because it seemed that most of these people actually didn't conceive themselves as different from the other Catholics. But this is another story. Let's just say that the order of Dominic of Calaruega actually started from there, and therefore the need to stem this heretical movement. And while talking about the Dominicans and Franciscans, we have necessarily to remember that the problems with heresy that had been there in the last 2 centuries in Western Europe were actually part of a bigger reason why these orders actually started. We will be seeing that better, especially when talking about the Franciscans. However, the expansion of the Dominicans, just for concluding about them, was immediately sustained by the papacy, and by the man of the Curia, and this we're talking about around the end of the 20s of the 13th centuries, and when we see these Dominicans actually spreading in all the most important cultural seats of Christianity, and the studia means the universities of Bologna in northern Italy and Paris, but even in the same Rome, so at the center of Christianity proper, meaning that there was a very strong bond between the Dominicans and the most prestigious teaching institutions, for the simple reason that the Dominicans were conceived as a sort of experts, not just of fighting against heresy, but consequently and necessarily to be very well educated, so very well trained, and university centers were obviously the best place where these people could, these friars could be educated and trained in theology to respond to the heretical ideas. And from these centers, eventually, that were obviously the major ones, the most important universities of Europe at the time. Rome didn't have a university by this time, but regarding to university, what happened is that the Dominicans initially went just to these studia, mainly Bologna and Paris. But eventually, when it started growing, they started becoming actually even many numerically. So the order sent a lot of people to these universities, and there wasn't even any space anymore to contain them all. So time after time, these Dominicans were sent to other universities, and especially they started to found schools on their own, because it was cheaper, obviously, and also because they began to expand all over Western Christendom. So the most gifted Dominicans were sent to the most prestigious university. They studied there. Eventually they would come back where they had started, or maybe as Dominicans, or maybe somewhere else, and they would start in turn to teach their brothers in places where there wasn't a school, and that therefore could be accessed by the local Dominicans. So it was a very massive expansion, a very structured one, and it proceeded generally in this way. The passing to the friars minor, obviously, this order had its first point of reference in the Italian Francesco of Assisi. Assisi is a place in Umbria. It's a beautiful place. If you go visit that, there are obviously many monuments, many buildings, many churches, and dedicated obviously to Francis. And who was this guy? Because his life experience is very important to understand actually the nature of the Franciscan order. Well, he was the son of a merchant, a very wealthy one, and in the first years of the 13th century, so paradoxically it's interesting that well, not paradoxically, but incidentally, that these are the very first years in which, in parallel Even Dominic of Calaruega was starting his work in the other part of Southern Europe. Francis began a life of poverty. He followed the gospel when Jesus answers the young rich, how he could reach perfection, and not stopping just to obeying the commandments, and Jesus answers, sell all your clothes or all your goods, and that's what Francis did. And it's quite meaningful, because if you were a son of a merchant that was even entering into knighthood, because in Italy at that time it happened that way. If you were wealthy enough, didn't matter whether you were not a nobleman, you could become, for census, essentially a knight. And Francis had been living that way. He had had a very mundane existence in his youth. He was living like a knight indeed, and making fights and playing dice and betting and going with all the beautiful women out there. He renounced to all of this. He started to do penitence, importantly, because obviously this was meant to, it was nothing new in Christendom to emulate, or at least trying to suffer as much as Jesus Christ during the Passion had done, and contemplating and preaching naturally. What did spark in Francis this decision? When, traditionally speaking, his existential perspectives were transformed by the meeting that he had with the lepers. The lepers in medieval Europe, as you know, were widespread, and obviously they were marginated. They were a bit of a symbol of social outcasts because of their illness. Much of the thaumaturgic powers, for instance, of Christian kings were about healing this form of illness more than others, seemingly, with their powers. And they were a bit the symbol of, the last ones of, about which the Gospels talk about. And for Francis, the meeting with these lepers was a sort of meeting with Christ. Christ, obviously, hiding and behind the most humble and the poorest and the people who suffered most. And in fact, this brought with Francis, obviously, the interpretation of the gospel as the reverse of mundane life. Like the first will be the last and the last will be the first. So he wanted to be one of the last. And closing to Christ's experience through this way. So he preached, obviously, the faith in the Eucharisty, and which renovated on the heart the real presence of Christ, obviously, according to Christian doctrine, and the very important aspect of this is that he wanted to, by preaching these precepts, to make the faithful act as a very self-conscious choice for orthodoxy, and especially Roman Catholic orthodoxy that naturally was not given for granted at the time for all the heresies that had been there. We will come back on this point because it's a bit more complex than this, and we will be seeing it in detail afterwards. The priest, coming back to the beliefs of Francis, was, and think about, the Protestant Reformation and everything that it's a bit about the history of Christianity and the meaning that and the roots that this had. The priest, in the perfect Roman Catholic orthodoxy, was the only one who could consecrate the body of Christ. So he had to be respected and accepted independently by his behavior and personal ethics. This was quite important because many heresies that had happened out there in previous years were based on the refusal, and it was a very ancient thing. It actually started with the Donatist movement back in the late Roman Empire. But this instance was retaken by other heretics who substantially said if the priest is a sinner, he cannot consecrate the body of Christ because he's not pure, he's not worth it. And Francis was extremely clear instead in stressing the fact that it's not about the person who administrates the Eucharisty, right? But the believer's faith and the true contrition and understanding and awareness and repentance in front of the sins that he has acted, from which he can get the grace, and this was extremely important for Rome, for the Church of Rome, because obviously the Church of Rome had lots of troubles with the heresies that went against this this principle, this precept, and it was favorably seen by the Church of Rome. By the way, this movement that, in spite of this orthodoxy that substantially characterized him, was growing very fast. In the very first years, the followers of Francis grew enormously, and you must think of the Roman Church obviously checking what was going on, because naturally we are living in a moment in which the Roman Church had a huge power all over Europe, a great territorial power, connected with Rome. I mean, we are at the peak of the temporal power and means of the Church of Rome. So obviously every group of believers, every new idea was checked, was controlled, because it could hide, more or less hide, and sometimes was clearly under the sun, heretical a heretical experience or an heretical preaching. And Francis movement growing so exponentially obviously was immediately checked by the Roman, by the apostolic seat. And the Roman Church did approve this this group, and we can't say order yet because one of the peculiarities of the Franciscan order is that it received from the Pope the the permission of preaching without an order that I mean before becoming an order, which means that they didn't have a rule already. And this is quite meaningful because it shows many aspects. First of all, how spontaneous this and how spiritual this order actually was. This group that hadn't become an order yet. Secondly, how distant it was in fact by creating a rule, because it wasn't much a matter of answering to like the Benedictines had done. You have this rule and you have to follow it, but it was the way of life of these Franciscans that was meant to inspire and to really characterize the movement. And Rome did understand this, and they were so happy and satisfied by Franciscan ideas and principles that they gave them they gave Francis the permission of preaching together with his brothers without a formal rule had been written down. Now this had some consequences that were quite important, because Francis died in 1226, if I'm not wrong, and even before dying, so even when he was still alive and was still obviously part of the movement he had created, this organism was starting to present some problems, because it was a huge movement, and it was meant to be a sort of vagrant movement, people that had a high degree of mobility and that often lived without any logistical support. I mean, just getting the offers of the believers and the communities they traveled across. However, when this order grew, it was evident that the original way of life showed by Francis, with hermetic experiences, living in nature, so a very heavy way of life, physically speaking, couldn't be handled anymore. This order had to find a different asset, and this was, however, conflicting with the original spiritual inclinations and to the primitive program that Francis had set. And this is extremely important, because even after Francis' death, and we can say throughout the whole 13th century, the order of the Friars Minor actually remained a bit troubled, let's say, between this original tension towards Francis' lifestyle and let's say, the originality of his message and of his behavior and way of life, that emphasized this pure relationship with nature, so true nature with God, and the acceptance of everything that nature gave us without any form of wealth accumulated, or with goods or property and so on. And from the other side, the the adaptation, in a way, to those needs of conventualization and sacerdotalization of the that, let's say, that were required by, I would say, physiologically, by the necessities of an order. So there was a lot of debate, obviously, even within the minor friar order, and even the church, because, and coming back to the point I was making before, what is also very interesting is that the Franciscan, let's say that it was a fringe of Franciscans that was actually going towards a very heterodox principle that really resembled, if not equated, the ones of many radical movements. That was essentially the point of, questioning the wealth of the church, the richness and property holding of the church. Before I mentioned the Reformation and Luther, because these were actually the same. This was one of the same topics that were actually discussed in the 16th century, and that we still find here. Can the church really hold goods? Can it really be rich? And should it be so? Telling the truth, it's a very complicated thing to explain. I am not very adequate to talk about it, because I don't know much about it. But let's say that parts, for what we're talking about, that the eventual settlement of the Franciscan order as a stable order in monasteries, so basically copying the Dominican model, that was a preaching and vagrant order in some way, but it did have some fixed basis, that obviously had properties, had, I don't know, for eating, they worked the land and stuff, and this was a bit forced by papacy itself, because at a certain point, even though they saw that the Franciscan order was an orthodox one, they started understanding that keeping the original vagrant lifestyle might have created problems for the same orthodoxy that the Franciscans were preaching, because someone was starting to question the wealth and the goods owning of the church. So basically, the order of Friars Minor was finally stabilized in the same fashion the Dominicans, who were doing quite good, by the way, had done. And by in conclusion, I would just like to mention that in parallel to the Dominicans and the Franciscans, there were obviously a lot of other groups that we often don't take into consideration. and then instead were quite important, such as the eremites of the Carmelo and the and of Saint Augustine, for instance, and many other groups, really many other groups that, by the way, were multiplicating in various parts of Europe, and that started behaving in a similar fashion to the preaching orders, so begging and conducting a mendicant life, but they were doing it in sometimes an irregular fashion, so these religious vagrants that such as the Beguines, the Beggars, and the Scolari, and the Trutanni, and these are weird names that they had, that were sort of expanding without control, and that hadn't had the same ordered, more or less ordered fashion of the Franciscans, and especially of the Dominicans. And there was a council in Lyon. It was the second one being taken in Lyon of the bishops of Western Christendom in 1274, that was extremely important for the history of the Church, because he tried to stem and managed, by the way, to stem all these manifestations, all these phenomena that were really about to escape the control of the ecclesiastical hierarchies. And the result was actually quite effective, because it took also very harsh decisions, because there was a sort of sacrifice of all the minor, let's say, or marginal religious experiences, to instead concentrate and focus and address towards the Franciscans and Dominicans, to whom was recognized the high function of ecclesiastical body. So that's why they became actually what they are today, and keeping in life either secondary orders such the Carmelitans and the Augustinians, and from which, during the 13th century, and well, even in the following centuries, even during the modern age, actually were formed other smaller orders, but essentially they all came from these that were set at the Council of Lyon. I think this is a very important page of Western religious history. I think it's amazing how orders that still exist today were actually formed at the time, and it's very interesting to analyze their genetic characteristics to better understand what was the religious tension and fervor of those times, but also which were the political problems of the Church of the Low Middle Ages to control a whole continent, and caring about the orthodoxy of these movements. These orders were also a very impressive phenomenon by themselves, not just because how they were born, but probably more importantly for how they developed in the end, because having good principles and good intentions is important. These people actually started, we saw that, with very positive intents that were in this sense prized by the Roman Church. The Dominicans preaching against the Cathar heresy, and the Franciscans trying to get closer, to approach more directly the example of Christ, to purify, in a certain sense, the church, and giving it a fully Christian address. But one thing is, starting with good principles, and another thing is to go on with an organization that has to take into consideration a lot of concrete problems that obviously cannot be escaped by goodwill. And the proof of the success that they had is shown by the fact that obviously these orders still exist today. It also tells us about how fervid and dynamic was the low Middle Ages, especially this 13th century, in which a lot really changed. A lot really changed. And in terms of economics, of society, and so on. And I believe that in a certain sense the birth of these orders actually reflected also the necessity of enclosing those mendicant and begging experiences that had been always there in Christian Europe into a more ordered and systematic pattern. Another important characteristics of these orders is that they had their seat in cities. That is also quite important. So the monasteries of these guys were actually very close to urban life, while the previous monastic experiences in Europe had been marked by this distance by the city, not really a complete detachment from it, a complete isolation, not at all, because monks had always to be in contact with the world, also for showing their way of life in order to inspire others. But Dominicans and Franciscans entered in that world of cities that were so exponentially growing during the 13th century, and where so many religious movements were actually taking place. So it's no chance that obviously the presence of Dominicans and Franciscans in two cities was meant to stem heretical movements that were quite catchy, let's say, among the town populations, and that therefore they could obstacle and fight from there. This also implied that a new form of education was needed. We have seen that the Dominicans were instructed and educated in universities, not just through catechism. So it's a picture of the world that is changing. And I hope to come back much on this 13th century because it's very important for European history, and it has to be understood quite deeply. So this was another long video. I hope you enjoyed, and see you next time.